Golden State Media Concepts Baseball Podcast. We cover everything Major League, from spring training to the World Series. We've got your favorite club covered, from New York to Boston to LA. This is the Golden State Media Concepts Baseball Podcast.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to the GSMC Baseball Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Jack Ridenauer, and we have an incredible show in store for all of you today. Hope everyone enjoyed their weekend and had a great time relaxing. I know there wasn't as much baseball as there was during the week, but this upcoming week we have a lot of really good games going on. Today I want to touch on some things that have been going on in the playoffs, some players to watch, and really everything in between all of those good topics. So I want to first get into some big takeaways from the first round of the games. I'll run through the recaps of the Thursday and Friday games, and there were some really, really good matchups there, so I'm excited to get down into those. Moving out of the wild card recaps, I want to get into my biggest standouts, who they were, and then some of the biggest disappointments also in the first round, mentioning both teams and players who stuck out to me, and discussing what players moving forward in the playoffs, what they need to do to give their team that added edge in the postseason. Later, I want to discuss some issues that the broadcasters have been having during the playoffs, and what the issues that were and that they ran into, and then also looking ahead into the NLCS and the World Series, where fans will be allowed to attend games, so that'll be vastly interesting. I'll also be able to discuss that, and I want to break that down and kind of share my thoughts on how that might be and what it might be, going to a game, or what it could be like, and being a fan during this time of period. I mean, it's got to be a very, very weird thing going to a live sporting event. So we'll get into that on segment 3, and then be sure to stick around for the final few minutes of the show, as I will discuss some of the records that were broken during the first round of the playoffs, and talk about some records that will probably never be broken, and other standout playoff records in baseball that still exist today. So a really big show, a lot of things going on, very playoff oriented, but hey, I figured it would be very fitting since we are right now in the thick of playoffs. So jumping into some Thursday games to get going, and I want to first dive into the Brewers and Dodgers game, and this was a Game 1 game, and again, very tough one for the Brewers, ultimately losing 2-0 to the Dodgers. But Game 1, I have to say, Brandon Woodruff did everything he could and more. I mean, he literally did everything he could and more. Excuse me, this was actually Game 2. So Thursday was Game 2 for the Brewers. This was the deciding game, and this is where they actually fell to the Dodgers ultimately and were exited out of the playoffs. So Thursday was Game 2, Wednesday was Game 1. So just wanted to clarify that. So getting into Game 2 of that matchup, Brewers losing 3-0 to the Dodgers. And like I mentioned, Brandon Woodruff pitched great. I mean, Brent Sutter, he pitched very, very well on Wednesday. I mean, he did everything and more he could also. But then Brandon Woodruff, I mean, he came right back and he did, a pretty solid job from the mound. He did give up, a couple runs here and there. But other than that, I mean, he was, pretty efficient. So it was pretty much scoreless the entire game, except for the bottom of the fifth inning, when the Dodgers scored their 3 runs all in that bottom 5 inning. And it was only 10 hits the whole game between the two teams. Milwaukee had 4 and the Dodgers had 6. Pretty quiet game, honestly, across the board. There wasn't a whole lot of offense going on. Avisel Garcia was 1 for 4 for the Brewers. Jed Jerko was 1 for 3 for the Brewers. And then over for the Dodgers, I mean, Mookie Betts was 1 for 3. Cody Bellinger actually was 1 for 3 also. So some, solid performers all in all for both teams, but nobody that really stood out that I would say. I would probably say, though, in kind of the top performers list, who I would have in that game, definitely would be Mookie Betts. I mean, he drove in 2 of their 3 runs, so he was pretty much responsible for over half of their offense that game. So I would definitely have to give it to Mookie Betts there. Moving into the next game, though, Braves and Reds. And this was, again, a game-deciding victory for the Braves. They ultimately won the series here in Game 2, 5-0 over Cincinnati. And, again, kind of similar to the Brewers, Cincinnati just had no offense. And I think that was the biggest thing is, these teams that are starting to really shine through in the playoffs, they're starting to show and they're starting to exude this confidence, not only from the plate, but also from the mound. It's these teams that have, almost dual threats, if you will. They can do both things. They can play, they can pitch very well. They've got great pitching. They've got great bullpen work, but then they also have great hitting, and they've got great offense, and they've got really, really good bats in their lineup. So those teams are starting to shine through and start, and the light is starting to, start to show on them a little bit more than these other teams like the Reds and the Brewers that probably would not have made the playoffs this year if it was a full season. I mean, same thing with, and I hate to say this, but the same thing with the Marlins. I mean, I know the Marlins are continuing to roll on. We'll get into their game in a little bit, but, they're starting to keep on going. But if it was a regular 162-game season, I really don't think that the Marlins probably would have made the playoffs. And I know that probably is, we can't really guess that because, from what they showed and from what they did this year, it clearly showed that they were, deserving of the playoffs in some sort of fashion. Obviously, rightfully so if they're in the playoffs right now. But nonetheless, I don't think that they probably would have made it, or the Reds, going through some of these other teams, Reds, Marlins, and Cubs Red, Marlins, and Brewers would probably be the three teams that I would say would not have made the playoffs if the season was a regular season. But getting into the game, the Braves scored 1 run in the bottom of the 5th, and then they scored 4 more runs in the bottom of the 8th. A really, really big performance for Ronald Acuna Jr. He was the top performer of the day, one of them at least 3 RBIs on the day for him. Marcell Ozuna, he had a 2-run home run, and then Adam Duvall also had a 2-run home run. So, really nice, solid spread out offense amongst 3 guys. Freddie Freeman didn't do a whole lot of anything. I mean, he wasn't awful, but he didn't do anything spectacular. He was 0 for 2, had 2 walks, but like I said, Travis Darnell, he was 1 for 4. Ozzie Albies was 1 for 3. Dansby Swanson was 1 for 4. Nick Markakis was 1 for 4. So they did have some guys producing pretty solid offense across the entire board. It was 9 hits in total for Atlanta on the game compared to Cincinnati's 2. So great job pitching-wise by the Braves also, which going into this playoffs, I really did not expect them to have the pitching that was going to take them far. I know that they were playing the Reds in the first round, so they had kind of an easy way into the NLDS. And again, also, a little side note for the Braves, this was actually the first postseason series that they have won since 2001. So congratulations to the Braves on their win. Very, very different from the Minnesota Twins, who are continuing with their very long losing streak that we'll discuss in a little bit. But anyways, back into these recaps. I want to move now into the White Sox versus Athletics. And again, this was a very exciting series. I mean, it went 3 games. It was one of the few series that went 3 games. And this was the deciding Game 3. Athletics winning it 6-4 over the White Sox, and it was scoreless through the first inning, and then going into the second innings, the White Sox put up 1 run in the top of the second, and then they put up 2 more in the top of the third. So they're winning 3-0 going into the fourth. Oakland put up 4 runs in the bottom of the fourth before Chicago scored 1 run in the top of the fifth. Oakland answered with 2 more runs in the bottom of the fifth, and that was ultimately all she wrote for the White Sox. A great performance from Marcus Semien. He was 2 for 4 on the day. Chad Pinder was 2 for 3, driving in 2 runs. Tim Anderson for the White Sox, he was 3 for 5. Luis Robert, he was 2 for 5, 2 RBIs, a home run, and he had a moonshot of a home run. And I know I've been kind of skeptical of him as a player and how, highly touted he is in all of these experts as scouts and all of these experts as, or all these experts, kind of reports and whatnot. But he's starting to show that he does have the ability to be a very good baseball player in this league. And I know that he's had, his average, honestly, if you looked at his numbers this year, they went up and down. They fluctuated greatly. So there wasn't a lot of consistency with him. But at the same time, he's showing in the playoffs right now that he can produce and that he can perform at a big-time stage at such a young age, which we're starting to see with a lot of these young guys. I mean, Fernando Tatis, I'm about to get into their recap, but he's played like he's been a veteran for the last 5 or 6 years, and his team has been in the playoffs every single season. It's pretty unbelievable how mature these guys are as players at such young ages. But getting into the Cardinals-Padres, recap of on Thursday, this was Game 2. So this is what pushed it into the deciding Game 3, which, again, I'll get into in just a minute. But Cardinals losing to the Padres 11-9. Again, reminder, the Cardinals won Game 1, and then the Padres winning this Game 2, forcing that Game 3. It was a 1-run inning by the St. Louis Cardinals that got things going, and then it was 3 more runs by the Cardinals in the second inning. So it's 4-0 heading into the third. There's no run scored there, and then going into the bottom of the fourth, San Diego puts up 2, so it's 4-2, and then in the top of the sixth, St. Louis put on 2 more, and then in the bottom of the sixth, this is where things really started to get going for San Diego, and their bats really woke up. 4 runs in the bottom of the sixth. 3 runs in the bottom of the 7th, and 2 in the bottom of the 8th. St. Louis did make some noise towards the end of the game, scoring 2 runs in the top of the 8th and 1 in the top of the 9th, so they almost made a little bit of a comeback. Ultimately, there was 25 hits on the entire day. San Diego did have 2 errors as a team, while St. Louis only had 1. So again, if you're San Diego, something that you need to work on and something that you need to look at moving forward in these playoffs. You can't allow to have 2 or 3 errors as a team. Some of these, as we get further in these playoffs, you're going to play teams that are going to be very unforgiving. And the team that they're about to play, and I know kind of a spoiler alert, but the Padres did eventually win the series. The Dodgers, they're going to be very unforgiving. They're not going to let you have any sort of room to, make back the mistake that you just made. They're going to make sure that you pay for that mistake. So anything that, the San Diego Padres do in terms of, giving up any freebies to the Dodgers, they're going to capitalize. And again, I don't mean to jump the gun here on this, breakdown and on this recap and kind of on this preview of this upcoming series, but it's going to be a really good series. It's going to be one of the most watched series, I think, the Padres and Dodgers. It's a great NL West rivalry right there. So, but anyways, a great game nonetheless, pushing it into Game 3, and then the Marlins and Cubs game was postponed for Friday, so those are the games I'll get into right now, and again, those were some really good games. Marlins winning 2-0 over the Cubs, and I have to take a second on the Marlins because the Miami Marlins have been to the playoffs 3 total times in their existence. The 2 other times in 1997 and 2003. Those are the only other 2 years that they've been there. They never lost one playoff series. Both years that they've been to the playoffs and that they've been wild card teams, because they've never won a division title either. So each time they've gone to the playoffs, they've been a wild card team. And every time they've gone to the playoffs as a wild card team, historically, they have won the World Series. In 1997 they did it, and in 2003 they did it. And again, also in 2003, and again another coincidence, they beat the Cubs in the NLCS to go to the World Series. In that famous Game 6, Steve Bartman, one of the Cubs fans, reaches over the railing and grabs the ball from Moises Alou, and they have that whole entire debacle that, they say curse the Cubs forever and whatever else, yada, yada, yada. That was the team that they were playing, I'm almost sure. Somebody, again, would maybe have to fact-check me on that, but I'm pretty sure they were playing the Marlins, because it was 2003. So, this team, coincidentally enough, this is the 3rd time that they've been in this situation, and all 3 times they've won the wild card, and the 2 other times that they've done that, they went to the World Series and won. So could this be a 3 for 3? Who knows? It'll be very interesting. But getting into the game, it was a scoreless game through 6 innings. No scores at all. Very low offensive, production for both teams. Only 5 hits each team. And then there was 2 runs that were scored in the top of the 7th inning. And that was really what blew things wide open for the Marlins. Sixto Sanchez was unbelievable for Miami. He was absolutely lights out. I saw a stat that they showed on the TV that he has the 3rd highest average mile per hour, register on his fastball in all of baseball at 97 miles an hour. I think, that was his average on his fastball this year. And so that was basically, that was his, that's an incredible number for somebody that is that young. That is very, very incredible. And to have the ability to do that and do that well, and to have that ability to, throw that hard. And he also, I'm pretty sure, he had a very short-lived minor league career. Okay, he didn't, he wasn't really, he wasn't in the minors for a couple of years. He didn't bounce around from A ball to double A ball. He was in single A for very few, games for, maybe just a season. And then he was promoted up into the majors, and then, he's been doing this, and he's been performing incredible. So he was really a big part of holding that Chicago Cubs offense. But again, that offense was not great this year. The offense, the entire season was poor. There's no question about it. When your leading hitter for most of the season was Jason Hayward, that should tell you something, because I don't want to take anything from Jason Hayward, but he hasn't been the hitter that he was his first 2 years in the league. But again, guys like Javi Baez, Kyle Schwarber, Ian Happ, Anthony Rizzo, those guys, Chris Bryant, they need to get those bats going. And again, unfortunately, their playoff hopes are completely out of it, and pretty much actually, all NL Central teams are out of the playoffs. So, the 2 divisions, and this is another just a coincidental thing that I just realized, the 2 divisions that had, some of the most teams make the playoffs, the AL Central and the NL Central, and also the counterparts to each other in those two leagues, the same, geographical quadrant since they're in the Central, all of those teams are out of the playoffs now. All of them. It is pretty much all NL West, NL East, AL East, and AL West teams that are all remaining. Everybody else is out. So just a little coincidental thing that I realized and, figured I'd share with everybody. But again, some of the top performers from the Marlins and Cubs games, Miguel Rojas in Game 2, he was 1 for 3. Garrett Cooper, 1 for 3, had an RBI. He was responsible for a home run, absolute moonshot too. I mean, he sent that one way into the bleachers. I mean, he absolutely got all of that one, and it was a very high arcing home run. I wasn't sure if it was going to be out or not. I mean, he got really underneath it, and it was a pitch right in his wheelhouse. I mean, I think it was a slider that did not break accordingly. It came right in. I mean, he's a righty batter, so it came right in on that right side of the plate. And, I mean, he just had, a field day, turned on it, and, it was out of there. So great hit by Cooper. That was really big for them. For the Cubs, Ian Happ was 2 for 4. Jason Hayward was 2 for 3, so they did have some good productive players for them. And then going into the Padres-Cardinals game, the deciding game in this matchup, and this was a really good one. It was, again, another scoreless game through the first 4 innings. And we've seen this a lot in the postseason. And I remember hearing Tim Kirchin mention how we're starting to really see how dominating the pitching is in baseball these days, and how lucky we are to see this good of pitching, because in all honesty, historically this has not been the case all the time with pitching. The pitching has been, no question, some of the best it's ever been right now in the league, and we're starting to see that. I mean, many of these games, I mean, look at the Marlins Cubs game. It was scoreless through the first 6 innings. And then the same thing with the Padres-Cardinals game. It was scoreless through the first 4 innings. In a lot of these games, it's scoreless through the good chunk of the first part of the game, and it's 1/2 frame of an inning that all of a sudden, decides the outcome of a game or whatever. So it's really, very small room for error in this playoffs, and I think all these teams know that, and it's just a very interesting makeup. We've got the Padres and the Marlins and the NLDS. We've got the Athletics in the ALDS. We've got some teams that we don't really see, make it to the playoffs very often, and especially in the position that they're in right now. So I think that's what makes this year even more unique. But getting into the recap of this Cardinals-Padres game, like I mentioned, it was scoreless through the first 4 innings, and then San Diego scored in the bottom of the 5th. They scored 2 more runs in the bottom of the 7th and 1 in the bottom of the 8th to ultimately win 4-0. And for the Padres, I mean, pretty quiet night from Trent Grisham. 0 for 5 from the plate, 3 strikeouts, did not perform well at all. But Mitch Moreland really coming up in the clutch, 2 for 4 from the plate. Eric Hosmer was 1 for 3. He had 2 RBIs. He actually had a home run. That thing got out of there really quickly. Manny Machado, he was 0 for 4. Fernando Tatis was 1 for 2. He had 2 walks. So, again, not a whole lot of offensive production from this very offensive, dominant, and power-driven team that we've seen all year. And, again, clearly, this is probably going to be, a team that people could argue is as deep as the Dodgers. I mean, you could really argue that this team is just as deep, and I think that it's more so just a matter of who the personnel is on each team, and also there is some veteran leadership on the Dodgers a little bit more than on the Padres, although you do have Manny Machado. But having Mookie Betts there, Cody Bellinger, although he's not a veteran, he's played at a very high level for the short amount of time he's been in the league. Max Muncy, Justin Turner, Clayton Kershaw, these guys are very seasoned veterans. For the Padres, I feel like they're kind of looking at their future in terms of once the Padres kind of age out. I mean, they'll probably, the Dodgers will never stop being good. But what I mean is that the group of guys that they have now start to age out. I think the Padres are kind of looking at their future of, this is what we're hoping to become. We want to be like the Dodgers. We want to kind of take a piece of their playbook and try to apply it to our team, because, again, we've got some great hitting, just like the Dodgers do. They've got great young players, just like the Dodgers do. They've got great pitching, just like the Dodgers do. So a lot of similarities between these two teams. So it's just, I think, a matter of where they are in terms of their development as a team and as a whole. And I think the Dodgers obviously are much further along, but the Padres will eventually get there. So getting into some ALDS matchups, I just want to give a little preview of the ALDS because, again, the NLDS, those games are, they kind of ended up a little bit later. Again, I'm recording this on Saturday, October 3rd, so those games ended up later. I want to get into some of the ALDS matchups. Astros versus A's. what I'm watching is how will the Astros respond to the 3-7 regular season record that they had against the Athletics. Between the two teams, only one player who was in the starting lineup for the two teams has hit above 300 for the regular season, and that is Michael Brantley. So think of that. 8 out of 18 starters between two teams, only one guy, 1 out of 18 is hitting 300 or higher. That should tell you something right there, that this is going to be a defensive battle, and this is going to be a pitching duel, if anything, unless one of these teams, their bats all of a sudden just wake up out of nowhere. The two teams were 5 spots away from each other in team batting average. The Astros batted .240 on the year, while Oakland batted .225. So again, neither team doing well from the plate. Oakland did have a much better ERA than Houston, with a top 10 ranking as a team in the league. So this might turn it into a pitcher's battle between those two AL West teams. Kyle Tucker and Carlos Carrera have been hitting very well for the Astros. So the A's and their power hitters, and Marcus Semien, who has already had a home run in these playoffs, and Matt Chapman and Matt Olson, this could turn into a down-to-the-wire series between these two teams, because who knows with the Astros? Again, I've mentioned it a lot before. They've got a lot to prove with all the offseason allegations and all the cheating scandal and everything. They have a lot of things to prove. They have a lot of people to prove wrong, because right now everyone is saying they can't win unless they cheat, and they want to prove everyone wrong, that they can win without having to cheat. So I think they're going to come with a vengeance on the Athletics, because, again, a 3-7 regular season record. The Astros probably want to, try and redeem themselves a little bit. But the A's, they're on a roll right now that I wouldn't be shocked. They eventually go to the ALCS. They looked really good against the White Sox, and they beat a really good White Sox team. The Chicago White Sox, I thought, were going to go to the ALCS. I really believe that. They were that good. So, I'm very hopeful for these A's, and I think that they're going to be just fine. And then for the Rays and Yankees game, I think this will be the Rays series, even though this Yankees team is significantly better as a whole in the regular season. But I do have my doubts about Tampa. Not that they aren't a talented team, but rather that they will be able to, if they'll be able to withstand the firepower of the Yankees. Giancarlo and Brett Gardner both had homers in the first series, with Stanton getting 2, and Urshela has been driving in runs left and right with 6 in the first round, and Gleyber Torres leads the AL playoff players in average with a .714 batting average right now. So they've been out of their minds hitting well, and again, a lot of their guys are healthy again, and they're back to 100%, so that is what makes them even scarier as a team. The Rays looked great in their first-round matchup with a dominant performance from Snell in one of the games, and the hitting came up clutch for them numerous times. So I am excited to see how this series pans out, because I could see a Game 5 matchup between these two teams, and that would be a lot of fun. Might be a new little rivalry in the AL East between the Rays and the Yankees. So that'll do it for us in this first segment, but stay right there, folks, because after the commercial break, I'm going to talk about which players and teams I felt were standouts and disappointments in the first round of the playoffs in the wild card matchups. Folks, stay right there. We'll be right back here on the GSMC Baseball Podcast.
This is your ultimate stop for everything sports. The Golden State Media Concepts Sports Podcast. Should I say more? From the NFL, MLB, the NBA, to MMA, it's all in here. The Golden State Media Concepts Sports Podcast. Listen now.
Welcome back to the GSMC Baseball Podcast. Jack Rydnar with you all, and in our first segment, I got into the recaps of the third and fourth days of the playoffs and the final few matchups of the Wild Card Series, and discussed the impending ALDS matchups and who are some teams and players to watch moving into the next round of the playoffs. Be sure to stick around for the final few minutes of the show, as I will discuss the numerous records that were broken in the wildcard rounds and what some playoff records are that may never be broken or that are pretty impressive nonetheless. I want to now highlight some of the disappointing teams and players from the first round and in the playoffs, and some of the biggest standouts of the first few days of the postseason as well. So getting into the disappointments that I was just very, very disappointed with, really the entire AL Central, the entire division that was in the playoffs this year. The Twins, the White Sox, and the Indians. I'm going to get into all three of them, why I'm disappointed in all three, but I was just very, very, almost confused, puzzled as to how three teams that were, 35 wins or more each not go past the wild card. They were all, technically the higher seeded teams in at least most of the matchups, if not all of them. I don't know how they were not able to, find themselves on the winning end. I mean, I guess maybe with the White Sox, they were going up against the A's, and the Indians had a healthy Yankees. But the Twins, I mean, come on. They were number one in their division. I'm going to get into it in a minute. I don't want to get too ahead of myself. So with the Twins, what is there to say about Minnesota, honestly? I mean, you lose 18 straight playoff games, which is a U.S. sports record, a North American sports record. 18 games, that is just awful. They didn't have a whole lot of help offensively either. They owned the worst batting average in the entire playoffs as a team, and it was bad. It was a 119 batting average bad. They didn't have one home run the 2 games they played, and they only scored 2 runs the whole series as well. After finishing first in the Central, they weren't the only team from this division to disappoint in the playoffs this year, not even close. The 36-24 Twins had only one guy to really perform for them, which was none other than Nelson Cruz, who was incredible for them all year long. He was unbelievable. But regardless, very sad to see a first-place team in what I think is one of the better divisions in baseball get bounced out of the first round against the cheating and struggling Astros. That is not a good way to finish the season. And I actually saw something, it was kind of funny. It was on social media the other day, and it said, I'm glad that I'm not a Minnesota fan. And it had the Minnesota Twins, 18 straight playoff losses. The Minnesota Wild, the hockey team, never made the playoffs before. The Minnesota Timberwolves have only had one playoff appearance, I think, and the Minnesota Vikings have lost in every single Super Bowl they've ever been in. So I kind of got a little chuckle out of that, just because it's not just the Twins, it's the entire city, the entire sports scene in the city. I don't know what it is about Minnesota. Anyways, going into the White Sox and what really disappointed me about them, the second of the 2 teams in this AL Central division, I mean, really, really disappointing, mainly because they were up 1-0 over the A's after Game 1. And I was not shocked that they were up 1-0, even though they were technically the 7th seed and the A's were the 2 seed. I didn't really look at that seeding because, in all honesty, the home field advantage did not really, I feel like, play a huge factor in all of this. Even if they were playing at each other's, home fields, there wasn't any fans there. If there was, it was just friends and family of the players, and that was it. So it wasn't a huge impact on the game. So I would not have been shocked if the White Sox had beaten the Athletics. I would not have seen it as an upset. But in Game 3, that is where the injuries really piled up for the White Sox, with their reliever Garrett Crochet leaving the game with some arm issues, and then Eloy Jimenez, their star-studded slugger, left the game with what appeared to be a lower body injury. They actually had gone through about 4 to 5 pitchers through the first 5 innings of the game. So they were they were running pretty thin in their bullpen heading into the latter half of the game. A really unfortunate way to end a 35-25 year, and this year they had their highest winning percentage since 2005 when they won the World Series. So that was going to be, what was going to be, I should say, a big year for Chicago, especially with how well Jose Abreu played, and Tim Anderson and Eloy Jimenez. Not to mention Lucas Giolito. I mean, having a lights-out year, pitching a no-hitter in the regular season, and then flirting with a perfect game in Game 1, or a perfect game in Game 1 of the postseason. An unfortunate way to end a promising year for this team. And I actually thought about it when I was, writing these notes up and, doing a little bit of research. I sat there and wondered, I wonder if he had thrown a perfect game, if there had been any other player. I don't think this probably would have ever happened. A pitcher that threw a no-hitter in the regular season and then a perfect game in the postseason. I did not do the fact-checking on that, so I don't know if that is true or not, but I doubt that there are many pitchers out there that have done that. So for the final AL Central team that really disappointed me, the Indians, I mean, it was incredibly disappointing, with how good of a season they had as well, in addition to how the Twins played and the White Sox played. Everyone has talked about Jose Ramirez and how good of a finish to the year he had, but it clearly didn't help his team much. I mean, I will say he did play very well in the playoffs, so I will give him credit on that, but it clearly was not enough. The Indians finished with the same record as the White Sox, 35-25, and were just as disappointing. I do give them a little bit more of leeway with the fact that, they were playing the Yankees, when they were completely healthy and they had a full roster. And when that happens, the Yankees, they are a legit team, so I understand that it was a tough road for them. And Shane Bieber giving up 7 earned runs in his first Game 1 start, that isn't a good way of starting a wild card series with the Yankees. And it was actually his first ever playoff game in his career. That was his first, that was his debut. So, maybe a little bit of nerves, a little bit of, wasn't prepared for the moment or whatever, not used to it, doesn't have the experience, whatever you want to say, but nonetheless, it doesn't take anything away from him as a player. Now, getting into some players that were pretty disappointing, I felt, Shane Bieber, he's right at the top of that list, a 13.5 ERA in his one start, registered a loss, went 4 2/3 innings, and 7 earned runs were given up by him, as well as 2 home runs. No way that he was performing like he was in the regular season in the playoffs. Not even close. And that's, in the regular season, he ran away with the Triple Crown and will most likely be named the Cy Young. I am shocked that he pitched that poorly. Now, I will say, it was his first, like I mentioned, it was his first playoff appearance, so maybe the nerves got the best of him, but not a great way to start your playoff career. With that rough of a start, Bieber finished the season with 122 Ks and 8 wins. And in the postseason, he didn't perform to that level in the slightest. I am excited to see him in the future, and as he matures, he will become much more accustomed to being in those big-time moments, no question about it. My next disappointing player has to be Miguel Sano. Sano was awful. Just flat-out bad. There isn't any other way of looking or saying it. He wasn't good in the regular season, and he was especially not good in the playoffs either. With a negative WAR and the league leader in strikeouts with 90, Sano's regular season was horrendous. And when he hits the playoffs, he didn't do much of anything when he came into the playoffs to help his team snap their postseason losing streak. Nothing at all. He was 1-7. He was 1 for 7 in the playoffs with no homers or RBIs. So pretty lackluster performance, if you ask me. Very disappointing season overall for Miguel Sano. And then Mike Moustakas, another guy that was very disappointing. I thought Moustakas was going to turn it around in the playoffs. I really did. I thought he was going to have, a completely different, postseason outcome than as opposed to how he was in the regular season. I didn't think that they would be able to get by the Braves. I felt that they could have maybe been an upset team, possibly, but they just didn't have the hitting to get them past the Braves. The offense was not there, and Moustakas did not help with that at all. He didn't gather one hit the entire series, and he had 2 strikeouts in the 8 at-bats. So he had, he was more than unproductive, as I would say it. He was just he was detrimental to their team. He was very detrimental to his team. I hope that he is able to come back next year with some improvement from his performance this year, because this Reds team seems, they see the opportunity they have to win potentially. I've said it a lot of different times on a lot of different episodes that this Reds team has a very fine window right now to win. They've got everybody that they need to win. They just need people to perform, and that is the biggest issue, is that guys are not performing. They just need to capitalize. And when guys like Moustakas and Castellanos are on their team and they're going to be there for a couple years, they need to make the most of it, and they need to be able to go out and win games and, secure playoff spots and not, have kind of a falling apart, if you will, at any point of the season. Although they didn't really have a falling apart during the season, they were just they didn't live up to the expectations that people, I think, set for themselves at all. So, again, Mike Moustakas, very disappointing. Reds overall, I wound up not being as disappointed because they finished really strong and they found themselves in the playoffs. So, maybe this team will get it together next year and the year after that. Aaron Judge is the last guy that was really disappointing and that really stuck out to me. This is going to be a shock for some people because although he didn't have the year he is used to having, he still batted just under 900 of an OPS, and he had 20-plus RBIs. But a 1-for-9 series from the plate for Judge in the first round of the playoffs is not going to help his team make the World Series at all. Stanton absolutely tore it up, and Gleyber Torres and Gio Urshela had all fantastic performances as well. But Judge was the only one who really had a difficult time from the plate. Judge did belt a home run, and he drove in 2 runs. But again, that will not be enough for this team moving forward, having one of the top power hitters in the league hitting 1 for 9. That will just not add up to a World Series championship. Although there were some players and teams that were, big disappointments like I just mentioned, there were also a lot of players and teams that were really good and stood out to me that played great in the wildcard games. So some of the standouts, first one I have to mention, Gleyber Torres. Everything that made contact with Torres' bat seemed to result in a hit, because with a 7.14 average in the opening round, it's no wonder that Gleyber was a big standout from the wild card. He went 5 for 7 from the plate with a home run, 3 RBIs. He was able to also draw 3 walks and didn't collect 1 strikeout in the entire opening series. Now, again, they only played 2 games, but still, pretty solid numbers in that opening round. Torres didn't perform in the regular season like he is right now. He only batted .243, which was over 30 points less of what he was hitting last year, which was a career high for him in 2019 with a .278 average. If Torres keeps this up and is able to really, take a big step forward in these playoffs more than he already has, man, this Yankees team is going to be even scarier than what people think, because if Judge is struggling right now and he's able to struggle, but guys like Torres and Urshela, and Stanton, Gardner even has been stepping up, are going to be right there to step up for the Bronx Bombers. They're going to be right there to slide on in and fill that void if Judge continues to have the difficulties that he's been having. But great sign that a guy like Gleyber Torres has been hitting that well for the Yankees, something that they're definitely going to need in the rest of these playoffs. And again, speak of the devil, the Yankees are another standout from that wild card round in the opening series, because the Yankees they're on a tear heading into their matchup with the Rays in the ALDS. And although the regular season does not go in their favor, where they were 2-8 against Tampa, they are a full, healthy Yankees team. And when that is the case, all bets are off as to what will happen. I mean, they go toe-to-toe with the Dodgers in terms of the deepest and the best starting lineup in baseball. Them and the Padres and the Dodgers, I would say, on paper, on what you see and what they bring to the table in terms of who the best are, lineup-wise and hitting-wise and power hitting-wise, all three of those teams stack up very, very similarly amongst each other. With the second highest average in the playoffs as a team, Padres are the only other team that have a higher batting average right now in the playoffs as a team at .318. They had the highest team OPS and were the only ones to compile 20 or more runs as a team, which were 22 to be exact. They clearly dominated the Indians by making a statement in that Game 1 matchup, taking down Bieber and rocking him for 7 runs and 2 homers. I mean, if they can do that as a team to the potential AL Cy Young winner, then the sky is the limit as to what this team is capable of doing. Another big standout, Tim Anderson. I'm really annoyed that the White Sox exited the playoffs so early, because I was really excited to see Anderson and how he would play for the rest of the postseason. The 9th-ranked OPS in the playoffs, a staggering, and I mean staggering, 1.429, which also shows if he's the 9th, the first has to be astronomical. I can't remember who it was, but I think they were over like a 4 OPS. I mean, it was something insane. Again, very small sample size, so we cannot take that. We can't really carry a whole lot of weight on that one. That doesn't carry a whole bunch of weight. But still, if the numbers are the numbers, and baseball is a very number-oriented sport, and if that happens, then, hey, that's impressive nonetheless. He had the second highest batting average and was one of only 6 players to have 2 doubles and one of 9 to have 2 or more doubles. So a big part of the offense for the White Sox was Tim Anderson. Anderson continued his elite hitting ability this year, ending the regular season with a .322 average and an .886 OPS. And he clearly took that level of play with him into the playoffs. I really wish the White Sox had won, because I felt that if they had moved on, Anderson would have made a ton of noise in the playoffs. Next guy that really stood out to me, Brett Gardner. I mean, Gardner hit very well in the opening round. Not as well as Torres, but still batted .375 with a huge home run, 3 RBIs and 2 walks. Although the veteran outfielder is getting older, he is still very productive and does a great job at leading this group of young, power-hitting players on a daily basis. A player who has won a World Series with this team back in 2009, which feels like ages ago, actually. When I thought about that, I said, wow, it's been since 2009 that the Yankees have won a World Series. That feels like eons ago. He does have the experience it takes to understand what it is exactly at stake with these games and what it will take to go to the World Series and to win a World Series. As they get into their series against the Rays, this is going to be a Brett Gardner that needs to pull out every last stop in the book to keep having this strong performance in the playoffs that he's been having so far. I mean, he's been playing really, really well. Next guy, and it's, again, another unfortunate player that is no longer in the playoffs, Trevor Bauer. The complete and utter dominance of Bauer was insane to watch. I mean, seeing his curveball just drop and then he pumps a 97-mile-an-hour fastball right after, he was untouchable. As it showed, the Braves couldn't score a run through the first 12, 13 innings of the game. I mean, he was literally untouchable. I remember watching some of the game and just seeing how much of in a rhythm he was, and everything he seemed to throw, he was either, if he was missing his spots, he was just barely missing, because everything seemed to be on point. Everything seemed to be clicking with Bauer that day. Bauer had the third most Ks this season, second most in the NL, as well as the best ERA in the NL with a 1.79 clip. In Bauer's one start in the playoffs, he went 7 2/3 innings. He struck out 12, and he walked 0, as he also gave up only 2 hits, and he actually became the first pitcher to ever have a 7-inning or longer outing with 12 or more Ks and no walks. So a pretty incredible feat to conquer in the opening playoff game. This was his best postseason outing, as his career ERA in the postseason is just a shade under 3 at 2.94, so a very solid pitcher in the playoffs, but unfortunately didn't get the help he should have from his teammates on the offensive end. Another guy that I thought was a big-time standout, Jason Naylor. Naylor became the first player to go 5 for 5 in their first 5 playoff at-bats, so clearly doing a standout job in that opening round. I mean, if you gather a hit in your first 5 at-bats in your playoff career, that's pretty incredible. I mean, that's very, very challenging to do, very hard to do. I mean, especially with just knowing what's at stake and what kind of that surrounding environment is. It's the playoffs, it's the postseason. All lights are on you, all cameras are on you, and the spotlight is literally shining on you and your team. That's got to be a lot of pressure, and to go 5 for 5 in your first 5 playoff at-bats, that's an unbelievable feat. What was a very poor year for Naylor quickly turned into a historic performance in the playoffs, as he came into the playoffs hitting only .230 and having 2 RBI the whole year. So a big flip for Naylor in October, no question. He also had 3 doubles in the opening round and a homer and 3 RBIs. So an overall great performance outside of the hits that he collected in their wild card battle against the Yankees. If Naylor keeps this up and brings this strong performance into the offseason and into next year, we could hear his name a lot more. I mean, he's a young guy. He hasn't had a whole lot of experience. I think this is something that is really good for his development in his career. So I think that moving forward, we might hear more about Naylor. And the last team that was a big standout for me, the Athletics. I mean, what a come-from-behind victory for the A's, facing elimination not once, but twice. They did everything and more to fight their way back into the series. Although they did not hit well as a team, with only a 194 batting average as a team, they found ways to win through clutch hitting and great pitching. They had a team ERA of 3.67, so not insane, but not awful. They were also second in the first round in strikeouts as a team with 29, so a huge factor in their wins over the White Sox. I think this team will potentially make it to the ALCS. They take on the Astros, which I think will be a solid matchup. But I ultimately think the A's are going to come out on top and head into the ALCS. The regular season head-to-head favors the Athletics, so I think ultimately Oakland will keep on moving towards that World Series if they are able to string together some big-time hitting performances. They're going to really need Semien. They're going to really need Olsen. They're going to really need Chapman to step up. And they're also going to need that added performance from Tommy La Stella, who was unbelievable for them in the opening round and has really been unbelievable for them since he arrived in Oakland. So this Oakland team is going to be very, very fun to watch moving forward. So that will close things out here for us in our second segment here on the GSMC Baseball Podcast. Thanks again for tuning in. Coming up after the commercial break, I'm going to get into the recent issues the play-by-play announcers had with the technology and the connection in one of the games, and then also what some other things that will be happening moving forward in these playoffs, like fans in the stadiums. Folks, it's been a lot of fun so far, but we got a lot more to go, so don't change that channel. We'll be right back here on the GSMC Baseball Podcast.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be, visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Baseball Podcast. Great to have you all here still with me today. Jack Ridenauer again, and we just closed out discussing the biggest standouts and disappointments from the wild card rounds. A lot of teams and players that really stuck out, either good or bad ways. I want to get into the topic of the broadcasting blunders the commentators had for the Game 1 White Sox-Athletics matchup, and then also look ahead to some of the recent stories about fans being in the stands for the NLCS and the World Series and what that could mean for those games. So the A's and White Sox game was somewhat of a nightmare to begin with, right when things started. And it didn't have anything to do with the playing of the game, but rather the broadcasting. So David Fleming, who was on the play-by-play call for the game, and Jess Mendoza, who was on color, had a hard time syncing their audio up to the live game feed, as Fleming seemed to be picking up the live feed, but Mendoza seemed to be on a delay. I was actually reading an article on The Athletic, and it said that Mendoza didn't even speak for an entire minute. So there was a long stretch of silence in the game where there was nobody talking because nobody knew who was in front of what. Nobody knew who was ahead and who was on a delay and who was with the live feed and then who wasn't. It was a big nightmare. And there were a lot of problems that can arise with this situation, mainly because these announcers are so many miles away commentating the games, and they have these kits that are sent to them, and they need to set it up themselves and whatnot. So a somewhat confusing process that could have a lot of issues. And I think they even, in the article, they talked to David Fleming, and he was quoted by saying, we get these in-house, do-it-your-own kind of kit thing, and we don't know how to do that. A lot of the times, it's just sent to us with instructions, and we have to figure it out ourselves, so it opens the door for errors. It opens the possibility for really anything to happen and really to occur, and that's the big issue right now. And we see it all the time. I mean, I don't think that's the first time this kind of new coming back of sports during this pandemic where there's been some sort of issue with the broadcasting feed or the live feed. And in the in-game interview, actually, with the manager, Bob Melvin of the Athletics, that was a mess because he couldn't hear anything. He seemed very frustrated over it. Actually, when he tried to put his headset on, they said that he just shook his head and threw his arms in the air, just saying, like, I can't hear you, and then he just took the headset off and then stormed off. And, David Fleming was quoted by saying, I don't blame him. It's very frustrating. This is all very frustrating. And the issue seemed to be that the music in the stadium was too loud. The stadium people in the scoreboard room were supposedly going to lower the music during the interview, but they kept it pumping through the system, and it incited many issues with the Melvin interview. And a lot of the issues were revolving around, the players wanting to have the music played. And, again, the players are playing, they get, first dibs and first rights to things. And if they want the music to be loud, well, the music can be loud. They're going to be playing, and they're, rightfully so. That's fine. But I will say you could tell in the interview, and you're just, again, this isn't something that I heard, this is just something that I read, but you could tell that Fleming, I think, had expected, and really everybody at the studio had expected, the music to be turned down to an appropriate level to conduct an in-game interview like that. So a few innings later, actually, Fleming and Mendoza were trying to have another interview with the White Sox manager, Rick Renteria, and they only got one question in before there were some technical issues during the broadcast. Mendoza tried to ask a question, and her feed actually got cut out. So, again, this is a big issue moving forward in the playoffs, because if you have this, occur during a championship series or even the World Series, all eyes will be on baseball, and those mistakes will be shown much more. They will come to the surface much more visibly, and they will be much more apparent if they were to occur than if they were to occur in a wild card series. There's so many games on. Not everybody can watch all games simultaneously unless you have some sort of fancy TV package or you have some sort of fancy TV. But other than that, you're not going to be able to watch all games simultaneously. So not every single person that is watching baseball saw that mistake. But come the World Series and come the championship series, fewer games, fewer, options of viewing and what to view in terms of baseball and games. So that's going to subsequently force people's attention on the two games or the one game that is being played. And if something goes wrong, even more people will be, will become aware to that, and they will be, much more exposed to that than if it was just, out of one of the many playoff games that were being played that day, that was, 8 or something like that. So again, it just goes to show you that things like this can happen, and at the biggest stage, it's unfortunate if it does, but again, we have to remember the parameters and kind of the overall, surrounding society that we're living in right now with COVID and with the pandemic. It's making things hard. It's making things very challenging. And the issue with the distance is this, the ESPN broadcast wants its announcers to use a television studio with a live setup. So this is why the broadcasters are in totally different places, because the play-by-play person has to be in studio, whereas the color person can be anywhere. So instead of doing it at home and having an in-home setup, and that was the way that it was set up to you and sent to you, and you just had instructions on how to set it up. Fleming lives in the San Francisco area, so doing the game at home for him in the opening round would have made much more sense than flying all the way out to Charlotte to call a game, which is where he had to go for one of the two of the or where he would have to go for one of the two studios there or Bristol. So those are the two ESPN TV studios that they use to broadcast these games. I know John Sciambi, he's been out in Bristol, I believe, and then David Fleming, he was in Charlotte. So guys have been floating around a lot. Mendoza was in her house in Oregon. So completely different, opposite ends of the country, opposite ends of the spectrum, and it turned into an issue like this. So I'm sure this was a very weird thing to do. I mean, fly clear across the country to commentate a game you aren't even at, which would be very odd to do in person. Hopefully they'll get all the kinks worked out by the World Series, because that would be, not the time to have any hiccups at all. Mendoza seemed to be very delayed on the broadcast, and Fleming was, again, not in sync with her, but the timing was incredibly off with the flow of the conversation. It was just a big muddled mess, and it was unfortunate that it had to happen. And again, it was nobody's fault, right? I mean, nobody was doing this on purpose. It's just kind of the way it was, and that's just how things kind of unfolded, and kind of a series of unfortunate events. And David Fleming, handled it very well. He excused Renteria from the interview and told him that he could leave, and he was able to move on out of that situation and get back to the game as best as possible. So they were able to work within the parameters and the guidelines that they had, but again, it just was really unfortunate that that had to happen. But I want to also talk about now some other news relating to the game of baseball, but it isn't playing related, just like the broadcasting blunders, and it is the recent story of fans being able to attend the World Series and the Championship Series at Globe Life Park, which, like the broadcasting blunders, are both very interesting and unique to the playoffs this year, given the circumstances that we are in right now with COVID. So ESPN came out with a story a few days ago, maybe a week or so ago, that the new stadium in Arlington that can seat 40,515 people is allowed to have 28% capacity, so 11,500 to attend the NLCS and the World Series as well. So both matchups can be attended by fans, which when you think about that, going to a live sporting event, I know we've seen it with college football and for some NFL games, but imagine going to a baseball game or going to an NBA game or an NHL game, games where fans coming back has not happened. That is not a thing right now. That will look really weird for the players, for the managers, for the fans in the stands. I mean, they'll probably say, "Wow, I forgot what it was like to go to a live sporting event. This is kind of crazy." Limited capacity. We'll see how fast those tickets go. I'll get into the pricing of them in a second here, because they're very reasonable, and I would not be shocked if people wanted to go and there was a large demand for those tickets and they sold very quickly. This hasn't happened in terms of a World Series being played in one stadium, and essentially not necessarily an off-site, but just having one house stadium since 1944, when the St. Louis Cardinals beat the St. Louis Browns in the World Series. Again, that was the last time that a World Series was played in just one stadium, because the two teams shared the same city and the same stadium at the time. So again, this is a very historic, monumental time right now in baseball history that is going to go down in the record books forever. The tickets, like I was about to mention, are shockingly reasonable, which I couldn't believe myself, with the NLCS being as low as $40 a ticket and $75 a ticket for the World Series on the low end. So again, very, very reasonable. So I feel like they can't really jack the prices up, because people will inherently say, well, I don't want to go anyways, there's this pandemic and I don't want to risk getting sick. So they can't really, skyrocket the price, A. B, people haven't had jobs in however many months, so nobody wants to pay $150 for nosebleed seats to go into the World Series, even if it's, limited capacity and everything. And C, they're trying to just make any sort of money back from what they've lost in the 3 months that there wasn't any baseball to begin with, and how they haven't had, they played 100 less games this year, so that's really thrown off a lot of things too. And if you think about it, having the tickets this low for a World Series is most likely unheard of these days. And I feel the normal asking price of those nosebleeds at the World Series are right around $90 or so, $100 or so on the cheap end. That's on the cheap end. So, a good solid $15, $20, $25 difference for those cheaper tickets. I mean, that's very, very doable, in my opinion. Seats are sold in 4 contiguous pods, which will be distanced 6 feet apart, and the seating will be alternating between people sitting in the rows of the seats in the middle of one row. So basically a group of 4 in one row's, middle part, and then the row in front of it, there would be people on either end of those rows in a 4-person little pod. So let's say in row F, there was a group of 4 right in the middle of the row. And then in row G, you had people on the one end on the left and one end on the right. That's kind of how the seating is going to look. It'll almost look like a checkerboard in some regards. It'll be very odd to see on TV, no question. But I think that'll be a normal thing until we have a vaccine. I think that if this goes smoothly, this is going to be how teams and, organizations and sports kind of go back to having fans very gradually. No seats will be available within 20 feet of the dugout, which is approximately 6 rows or so off of the dugout. And of course, no fans are allowed to go down below to try and get autographs, which I'm sure is a very unfortunate thing for players and fans and everybody alike. I mean, not the no giving autographs kind of reality that we are in right now. The players probably don't like, because I'm sure they miss that interaction, being able to give a fan that experience that they would have otherwise not been able to have. And so I'm sure that, just as much for the fans, it is difficult for the players, because now they don't get to have that interaction. Masks are required and mandatory for all fans, except when they are eating or drinking at their seats. They are cashless concessions, so you have to use all card, and the parking is also all card. So again, kind of going towards a minimal amount of contact and a minimal amount of sharing of anything as best as possible in order to refrain from any sort of spreading of the virus potentially if anybody were to have it. So this is going to be really weird to see, and going to one of those games would be honestly historic in a lot of ways. Something that hasn't ever happened before, with a limited seated stadium, having to wear masks, sitting in patterns, and a neutral site. Not to mention it's the World Series, one of the most storied athletic events ever. This is going to be monumental, and we are literally going to witness something that is a part of history, really. What I'm curious to see is if the players are going to be affected by fans being there. How will this play into their performance? Are they going to be out of whack playing in front of a crowd with actual noise and not hearing that fake kind of stadium crowd noise being pumped into the loudspeakers? Or is this going to be something that really motivates them and excites them, since fans are finally back and they won't have to hear fake noise anymore? Could this incite them to play really well and motivates them to, play even better? Who knows? Potentially. I mean, I think they will love to have the fans back, but we have to remember, if there were to be any sort of issues of a fan coming in that contracted COVID and they didn't know, or their test, didn't come back until later, or there was a false negative, or whatever the issue might have been, and they go to the game and potentially infect others, how could that impact this late season? Highly significant games that are going to need to be played. You can't, postpone it for 2 weeks. You can't prolong it or anything like that. I mean, imagine if a slew of fans got infected. Let's say about 80 people. There was some outbreak and about 80 people got infected. And again, for whatever reason, the percentages are always very, very small, I feel, in the grand scheme of everything. But the fear of it being so easily, spreadable, that is the issue. That is the cause of concern. But again, imagine if a slew of fans got infected and it spread to other sections. The backlash would be that would be received would be insane. And I think and I think that based on just kind of other things that I've heard in the news. I mean, I know that recently the Kansas City Chiefs, the football team, they actually had a fan that apparently tested positive for COVID and was at the game. So that does happen. This could potentially occur. And we've seen it with college football. There's a lot of fans, students there that are going to the games not having masks. I feel like these, there needs to be, a strong implementation of these rules in order for people to follow. And I feel like if they do have to implement these rules and the measures to ensure that these types of issues won't happen, because if it does, there won't be a good reception from the public. I mean, just imagine what would happen if, all of, 100 people in one whole section, the entire Section K got COVID. and all of a sudden, you're on, instead of just ESPN, you're on CNN, you're on Fox News, you're on MSNBC, you're on every single news outlet because you allowed fans back in, you allowed for a crowd to gather, and you try to control it, and this happened. And again, some of it is, somewhat out of people's reach, and some things are out of people's control, but regardless, we have to be very mindful of people's health and people's well-being. And, in the public eye, this could be seen as a detriment to people's health, allowing fans to go back to the games and to the stadiums. I personally love it. I'm glad that it's happening. I think that it could go very well. I think a lot of things are going to, positively come from this. I don't think there's going to be any issues. But I can see why people might say, like, hey, this could be a big-time problem. I can see why they think that. In all honesty, I think this will be the first sign of something normal on the TV since sports starting back up. So I am excited. I am hoping that this is the beginning of fans being allowed back into the stadium. I actually have a friend of mine. He's a really, really big Rays fan. And I was talking to another friend of mine the other day, and he was saying that it's a mutual friend of ours. And so our buddy, who's the big Rays fan, he's going to potentially go to the World Series with his dad if they were to play and make it to the World Series. I guess him and his dad have already talked about, going to the World Series and getting tickets if the Rays wind up in it. And I already know that once he goes and he comes back, I'm going to have to ask him a million questions because I want to know what it's like going to a game during the pandemic. What was that just ambiance like? What was the overall environment like, kind of just the entire feel of the stadium and the atmosphere really of the entire World Series. What was it like? And I would just love to hear from him, what he has to say about it. And he actually went to the World Series, I believe, back when the Rays went so many years ago. He's from Tampa. He's had season tickets for years, so he's a diehard fan. And I would love to ask him, compared to that World Series game, I mean, there's got to be so many, differences in those two. Is there anything that was similar? And just ask him any sort of questions. But again, that is a bridge that we're going to have to cross if and when we get to that, because who knows if the Rays will make it. But I'm hoping that there won't be any more issues that come. But I think the personnel has been on their A game, honestly. And the fan situation, I think, will work out all right. It'll just be a matter of fans, can they follow the rules? But also if those rules can be upheld and carried out, because if not, then that is where we will run into issues with fans in the stands and, people potentially getting sick and contracting COVID-19. So that'll do it for this segment, folks. But stick around and don't go anywhere, because we'll be right back after this commercial break for the final segment today, where I will get into a discussion on all the records that were broken and what some records were that may never be broken or are going to be hard to surpass. Don't go anywhere, everyone, because we have one last segment here on the GSMC Baseball Podcast.
Want to know the latest in soccer? Then listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Soccer Podcast. From MLS, the World Cup, and the Premier League, we've got you covered. The latest updates, the hottest matches, and news on the league's top players. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Soccer Podcast.
David Beckham scores the goal to take England all the way to the World Cup final.
Listen now.
Hey everyone, and welcome back for the final segment here on the GSMC Baseball Podcast. Jack Ridenauer still with you, and in the last segment, I discussed the recent issues that ESPN had on the broadcast for the White Sox-A's game, and then looked ahead to some new additions to the NLCS and the World Series that are coming up soon, which are fans in the stands and what that could mean for those teams. I want to close out the show today discussing the records that were broken in the first round of games and what some records are that will be hard to break, or most likely impossible to break, really. So some of the records that were really stuck out to me and that just kind of caught my eye, if you will. First one, Fernando Tatis and Will Myers becoming the first teammates since Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig in 1932 to each hit 2 home runs in a game. So again, not really a record breaker, but something that a milestone that has not been achieved for, almost 100 years, whatever that might be, 80, 90, some odd years. Quite some time. And they've been on a roll lately. Tatis, Myers, Cronenworth, they've all just been on a roll, and they are heating up right at the right time going into this battle with the Dodgers. I'm excited, and I mean excited, for this NLDS matchup between San Diego and Los Angeles. So the next record, Josh Naylor of the Indians became the first player to get a hit in their first 5 plate appearances in the playoffs. He went 5 for 5. Really, really nice job by Naylor. I mean, he completely changed his season. He had a really, really dismal year for the Indians, floated around between a couple other teams and ultimately landed in Cleveland, and he was awesome for them. Unfortunately, they did not move further into the playoffs, but hey, if they had gone further into the playoffs, Naylor was looking like a guy who could have been, a perfect, I don't want to say, kind of just a great playoff underdog story of somebody that you would have never thought having a great performance in the playoffs, and ultimately was able to, really shine and step up to the stage and perform at the highest level that he possibly could. So, hats off to Josh Naylor there. The next one, Braves moving on for the first time since 2001 to the NLDS. So congratulations to Atlanta. Really, really nice job. And then the next one, Alex Kirilloff, who's a Pittsburgh native from Plum. And I might have mentioned this in the last episode, but if I didn't, I'll just reiterate it. I live in Pittsburgh, and so Plum is an area outside just about 30 minutes of the city. It's a very large kind of township community that is just, it's a huge housing plan area out about 30 minutes outside of the city. So really, really cool thing to have Alex Kirilloff as a Pittsburgh native who was able to, make his he became the first ever rookie to have their first ever career start occur in the postseason and their first ever hit happen in the playoffs as well. So two records in one, in a sense, just for him being able to start and get a hit and be in the lineup. One of very few players to actually ever have their season debut and their career debut be in the playoffs. So again, just a very monumental day for Alex Kirilloff. Really highly touted player out of Pittsburgh. A lot of people have talked about him. He was a first-round draft pick for the Twins a couple years ago, so he is going to be really good, I think, down the road, and I think that it's just going to be a matter of time before people really start to catch on and they start to hear about his name more and more. Next guy, Trevor Bauer. He became the first pitcher to not allow any runs or walks and collect 12 Ks, going 7 or more innings. A huge accomplishment for him, and I think I heard also that this was I think it was the most amount of 12-plus strikeout outings for pitchers in one day of playoff baseball, or in one round of playoff baseball, because Garrett Cole had, I think, 13, Clayton Kershaw had 13, Bauer had 12, and somebody else had 10 or 11 or 12, I can't remember, but I just remember Tim Kirchin on the TV saying something about it, because he is the record. He is literally a walking record book, so I take everything that he says with a lot of weight. I just can't remember what it was that he said, but it was something like that. It was very incredible because he brought it into the point of how well the pitching has been, not only this year, but just in recent memory in the last few years. And I mentioned it earlier on in the show, this is a very, important and a very pivotal time for pitchers in baseball right now, and just the history of the sport, because we've never seen pitchers that are performing like they are right now. And then one other negative kind of record, I hate to bring it up, but it was, again, it has to be brought up, and it's the Twins. They just set the record for the longest losing streak in postseason history across all North American sports with 18. They can't get anything to roll for them in the playoffs, which is really sad. Really, really sad. There were a lot of records that were, set that first day, and it was really awesome to see players like Naylor, who we may not have heard of if he hadn't had that kind of performance in the playoffs. So it's great to hear about these new names. But I want to now talk about some of the playoff records that I think will probably never be broken, because they are just too unbelievable, I think. So the first one is Mariano Rivera's career ERA in the postseason, which is 0.70. And he did that over 141 innings in the playoffs. This is an insane number, and I mean insane. There is no one in the top 10 all-time except Christy Mathewson that is within 80 innings pitched in the postseason. So think about that, right? He is by far leaps and bounds having much more experience in the postseason than any other pitcher has ever had. 141 innings in the postseason. I should retract that statement, because there are other pitchers that have had way more innings in the playoffs. But he's probably one of the few, if not the only, closer relief pitcher to have that many innings pitched in the postseason. But he's definitely on this list, leaps and bounds further than a lot of other people on it. Again, Christy Mathewson, I mean, he's the next guy. I mean, he's not even within 80 innings pitched in the postseason compared to Mariano Rivera. I mean, that is insane. He was the highest innings pitched in the top 10, and he still has the best ERA out of all of them. He was more dominant than them, and he had way more opportunities to mess up, and he clearly didn't do that. I mean, Mariano Rivera was unbelievable, and, just watching him in the postseason, you could tell that was his time to shine. He kind of came into his own during that time of period in the fall time for baseball, and, watching him on the mound, I mean, it was, those playoff runs with the Yankees in the later 2000s and earlier 2010s, incredible to watch. So the next record, again, Mr. Mariano Rivera, career saves at 42. The next closest pitcher to him is Brad Lidge with 18. So nowhere even close to breaking that. And it makes sense that Rivera has had such a large, sample size because he is the career leader in games played in the postseason as well. So not only is he the career leader in saves and in ERA in the postseason, but also in games played. So he's got a large sample size to pull from, and he still is the all-time leader. So I think that just carries even more weight with these records, and it really kind of puts an even bigger, emphasis on these records that he has set and on this, on these historic milestones that he was able to, put for himself because he had such a large amount of time in the playoffs. He had so many opportunities to mess up. He had so many opportunities to not perform well, and he was able to shine through, and he was able to consistently and constantly, year after year that they were in the playoffs, perform at that high level. So the next record that I really don't think could ever probably be broken is Deacon Phillip. Career record for complete games in a season with 5. So in one playoff season, in 1 year, he had 5 complete games. I mean, this is a record that won't be touched by, anybody really. And the Pittsburgh Pirate pitcher, he was unbelievable. He's, this was a record that was set in 1903. And because of how pitchers are monitored in these days and in today's world, and how, much of a kind of, I don't want to say a point of emphasis, but really just, a big focal point in health for athletes is, minimizing the amount of wear and tear damage, and especially with pitchers. You start to see many more pitchers with Tommy John these days than you did back then because they're starting to throw the ball harder. Their curveballs are coming in harder than they ever have. Their fastballs are coming in harder than they ever have. So it's starting to put on more of a wear on their arms, and it's starting to really, in some cases, deteriorate some guys' arms. I mean, you hear about guys that have elbow issues for years, shoulder problems, rotator cuff issues, and as baseball has progressed forward, you could probably see a correlation in the increase in injuries over the years. Now, you'd also probably see an increase in, recovery and the speed in which the recovery happens. But I just think that this record, with how, like I said, closely monitored and how watched these pitchers are and how careful these managers are, especially in the postseason and in this day and age, I mean, there's not going to be, I think, many pitchers that are going to even come close to having 5 complete games in a postseason in the day and age in which baseball is and be able to be successful and their team is able to go far. I mean, teams would never allow one of their aces to go multiple complete games in a season of playoffs because, I mean, they could burn them out and then lose them to injury midway through and not have that strong pitching on the field. There may be a day when a team starts to pitch their ace more and they go lengthier games. Maybe some pitcher will come along that feels no pain and, needs no days of rest and he breaks it. I don't know, but I do know that as of now, this record will not be touched. So the next record, another Yankee, going back to kind of, the theme of Mariano Rivera and kind of the dominance of the Yankees. And a lot of these records actually were former Yankees players, and it doesn't surprise me at all because the Yankees probably have been to, I don't have it in front of me, but probably been to the most playoff appearances since they've won the most World Series, and they've probably been to the most World Series as well, I'm just guessing. So it's no shock that a lot of these players are, great Yankees players. And this guy was a great Yankees player, Derek Jeter, career at-bats in the postseason with 650. This is going to be one that could maybe get broken, but I don't see it happening, mainly because the next active player to him is Yadier Molina with 358. So he's just about 300 at-bats behind him, and Molina's probably on his last, third year of his career, maybe the last second year of his career. And yeah, he still is playing, but again, clearly not the way, that out of the, the career that he's had, and that he's been the level he's been playing at. It's clearly starting to kind of go downhill a little bit. I think this is going to be a hard record to break because a player, I feel, would need to be on a dominant team for a really long time that is making consistent deep playoff runs like the Yankees did during Jeter's years. And the next closest to him on the list is Bernie Williams, and he's well out of the league. So I think that it might be quite some time before anyone really comes by and challenges this record. And the next record again, Mr. Derek Jeter, is career singles, which is 143. And this is a clear runaway for Jeter as well, which Yadier Molina actually trails him in the rankings. But he is nearly halfway to where Jeter is, as he has 78 singles in a career. But again, as his career winds down, I don't see this being broken. The only way is if the Angels, the Cardinals, started going to the playoffs more and more, if you started seeing the only way that this record is going to get broken is if the Angels started to go to the playoffs more, and we were able to see, Mike Trout play much more frequently in the postseason. I mean, the guy, I don't think he's been in the playoffs ever in his entire career. So somebody who's arguably one of the greatest baseball players of all time, who's never been in the playoffs, if he's ever been, it's been one time, doesn't even have any legitimate playoff records that could potentially go up against some of these greats, and he's deemed as one of these greats. So it's very ironic, I think. But I think that if they were to have a complete turning of the tide for them and really change the trajectory in which their franchise is going right now, I mean, you could see Mike Trout in some of these record books. You could really see him on some of these lists. And it's kind of wild to see how many records Trout could or would have if the Angels were actually good, because I probably would have, run away with some records, and he knows that. He probably would have run away with some records, and he definitely knows that. No question about that. So the next record, Bernie Williams, career RBIs at 80. This is a breakable record, but I think it's going to take a long time before someone comes along and breaks this record. Maybe someone like Rafael Devers could break this record, but I don't think it'll be a record that'll be touched for quite some time. Quite some time. The next active player on the list is Albert Pujols, and he is all the way at 6th with 54 all-time. So I doubt he will catch Bernie Williams. But again, another record that is pretty hard to reach. 80 career RBIs, and you also have to remember that is on a finite scale because you don't play a whole lot of playoff games to begin with. So if you're able to muster up that amount of runs driven in the smaller amount of games that you play in relation to your entire career, that stands out. That really sticks out to people, especially Hall of Fame voters or just anybody that is, journalists, people that are covering, the sport, people that are following the sport, whatever. It really stands out to people. So the next record, again, Mariano Rivera, he had a lot of career records. This is career win probability added at 11.7, and this is an interesting stat, which basically is a measure of, a team's chance at winning when that player is on the mound or at the plate or in the field. And for Mariano, it was clear that when he was on the mound, his team had an exponentially higher chance of winning as opposed to other players on the field. Curt Schilling is in second place with a 4.1 WPA, which is still good. Considering no one on the list is higher than 4, but the separation between Schilling and Rivera, it shows how dominant he was as a closer and how shut down of a pitcher he was. Imagine having that job where all you had to do and really to get is 3 to 6 outs every time you pitch, and you just know that when you're on the mound, no one is going to touch your stuff. That's got to be a pretty, a feeling that I don't think could be described. Having that kind of confidence and that kind of ability about yourself, that's something that is far and few in between. It's very unique, and it's something that not many people are able to do. So the next record, we'll only have 2 more big records, and one of those 2 is Yogi Berra, another Yankee, World Series career record at bats, with 259 career at-bats in the playoffs. Now, I know this isn't a general playoff record, and this is just in the World Series. This is just the World Series career record of at-bats with 259, not just the general playoffs. But when you think about it, this is a record that may never be touched, because how often will you see a team that dominates like the Yankees did back in the 40s and 50s? And it makes sense. He's on the list, and the next few players after him are also fellow Yankees. Mickey Mantle, Joe DiMaggio, Phil Rizzuto, very famous players from New York from way back in the day. this is a record that would take a long time to break, and it would really depend on a team, going to numerous World Series and having the same core group of players with them the entire way, which would allow for, a player like Yogi Berra, who would be an everyday player, to get that many at-bats and that many reps. That is the big thing. He was going and being exposed to being in the World Series and going to the World Series year after year, an everyday player. He was a catcher. Not many people are going to, sub him out. Nobody's going to take him out of the lineup. So as a result, going to a lot of World Series, he got a lot of at-bats. So again, it's very interesting. It's a very kind of a curious thing if anybody could beat that record. But it's a record that I think maybe could have a chance if there was a team that were to come along, down the road that would dominate for, an entire decade, and they had a couple core guys, and one of those guys was a standout, catcher or first baseman or whatever, and he wound up having 300 career at-bats in the World Series, whatever. But, just kind of, a little food for thought there. My last record, Mark Buehrle, career walks per 9 innings, which is a .293. Talk about keeping guys off the base path. Buehrle had it figured out in the playoffs when it came to keeping batters off the base path and limiting the number of walks he would allow. This would be a really hard feat to conquer for a career, mainly because the next closest to him is Schoolboy Rowe, which is a pretty cool name. I've never heard of the guy, but it's a really cool name. And Deacon Phillip, who we heard about earlier, and they have a .391 and then a .720 average respectively. So Buehrle is leaps and bounds away from Deacon Phillip and is pretty close to Schoolboy Rowe. So it makes me believe that Rowe's record stood for a long time before it was broken. And this is a record that unless someone like Dustin May or Sixto Sanchez comes along and is mowing guys down when they pitch in the playoffs, I don't think anyone is going to break Buehrle's record for a really long time, if ever. So some really great playoff records, that were set, and some milestones that were achieved, and also a couple that were kind of unfortunate that were achieved by some teams. But again, that's the beauty of baseball. That's the beauty of sports. So that'll wrap it up for us here today. Thank you for listening to the GSMC Baseball Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I would like to ask you that you please remember to subscribe to the show and write a nice little review that really helps us. Also, if you can please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, we would really appreciate that so we can keep you all clued in to things moving forward in the playoffs this year. Once again, everyone, thanks so much for listening and have a fantastic day.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Baseball Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.